Hello, everybody. My name is Tom Cobben, and I am a principal solicitor at a law firm called Beryl and Watson Lawyers. We specialise in insurance and superannuation claims for people who are seeker injured, and we also do a lot of other insurance work. I'd like to start this presentation today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all join this meeting from today, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. This presentation is going to touch on a topic that's slightly different for us being an insurance firm, but an area that we have done a lot of work in because of the nature of the ways that our clients present to us. So because of the other issues that our clients are dealing with, we often become involved and help people with claims for Centrelink entitlements and have become expert in how these entitlements work by virtue of the work that we do, but also close relationships that we have with organisations like Social Security Rights Victoria. So this presentation will touch on a bunch of things and will be relevant to those people living with MS, covering topics like the disability support pension, job seeker payments and carers payments, and looking at the eligibility criteria and income and asset thresholds for those people through the MS lens. So the first benefit firstly, we're going to speak about what the amount of the payments that people who are entitled to JobSeeker or DSP benefits are. In other words, what their rates are. They're provided on the screen. I won't go to them directly. They change over time, and that is the rate as at the time of this presentation, which is in October 2024. DSP rate there for both includes supplements like the energy or the utilities supplement that's available at the present point, and they will vary over time, as we'll see on the next slide. Sorry, no, we won't see it on the next slide. What we'll see on the next slide is the income tests. So when you're receiving or being paid job seeker and DSP payments, you are entitled to earn income from other sources. The tests for being eligible to these benefits is quite complicated and takes into account whether or not you can work and at what hours. But as an aside from that, you can also earn income from personal exertion or in other ways, investment income, and provided that the income that you earn is less than currently $150 per fortnight on the job seeker payment, the rate of the payment that you receive from the job seeker won't be affected. But once you earn more than $150 in any given fortnight, Centrelink will start to reduce the amount of the job seeker payment that you get. There's a similar test for DSP, which I'll speak to in a minute. However, it's important to know that once, as a single person, you're earning more than $1,479 per fortnight, you're going to get nothing. That's when the amount of the job seeker payment will peter out, and certainly, over $1,000 in a fortnight, if you're earning that much, the amount of the job seeker payment you're going to get is very small. The income rates, importantly, are different for single and couples, and we'll see that quite a bit throughout this presentation on the different thresholds. So these amounts are amounts paid, as I said, from personal exertion. So if you have a job and you're out there working, but also investment income that you might have from an investment property, which would be an asset, and so relevant to the assets test, which I'll speak to in a minute, but also generating an income, which is important from an income test. So you are got in two ways there when you have an asset which is creating an income. This income can also be what's called deemed income. So if you have money sitting in an account, whether or not it's invested or not, if it's not invested, Centrelink will deem an income on it. So it will say, all right, well, you've got this pot of dough. It's not creating any income for you, but it really could be. And so we'll deem an income on that asset as well. So the next slide is about the income test for the DSP, and really just to show you that the tests are different. You'll remember from JobSeeker that the threshold at which payments start to be impacted from a job seeker perspective was $150 per fortnight, whereas with the income test for the DSP, you can earn up to $212 per fortnight as at September 2024 without it being impacted, and then 50 cents on the dollar after that. And that in turn means that the absolute cutoff for those is different as well. So $2,500 for a single person and more for couples. And it just says there that if you are working more than 30 hours per week, the DSP will be suspended. One of the eligibility requirements for the DSP is that you're working less than, I think, 15 hours per week. I'll get to that in a minute. And so if there is a consistent work of working of more than 30 hours a week, you'll be kicked off and need to reapply at some point if it's for more than 2 years. So I've spoken about how there are thresholds of income that you can earn, and I've also spoken a little bit about how those income thresholds can interact with the assets test. This is the asset test, so you'll see that they are the amounts of things, assets that you can own, and they vary for people who are homeowners and non-homeowners. So your principal place of residence and your superannuation are exempt assets, so they're not included in your assets test. But if you do own a home and you live in it, you can own less assets before, or fewer assets before the assets test will kick in and start to impact on your DSP and JobSeeker payments. So, the example given there is that if you're a single person and you own your home, it's $314,000 in assets that can be owned before there's any impact. If you're a non-homeowner, there's an extra couple of $100,000 in the test there. That's how it works because of the principal place of residence exemption for homeowners. And importantly, it's not a case that if you have assets of greater than $314,000 as a single homeowner, you will not be entitled to the DSP or JobSeeker. You lose $3 a fortnight effectively for every $1,000 above the limit. So for a single person who's a homeowner, you can have assets totaling $695,000 before you lose all of your payment entitled in its entirety. So deemed income, as I mentioned before, can be on top of the assets test. So in addition to having an assets test being above the minimum threshold on the assets test of 314 and losing income from DSP or JobSeeker because of that, you may also have a deemed income on the asset if it's effectively cash in the bank or something like that, which is otherwise not earning income. And that deemed income will also come off by virtue of the incomes test, which I mentioned previously. So that's how those tests work. As an aside, benefits do increase over time. So the JobSeeker and DSP payments are both subject to an indexation or an annual increase. The JobSeeker payments and the DSP payments are indexed or increase at different rates. So for JobSeeker payments, as it says there, the CPI, they increase by the Consumer Price Index or CPI, whereas the DSP payments are aligned with increases in the male average weekly earnings. The DSP payments therefore increase at a higher rate generally than the JobSeeker payments, and that the interesting thing is historically these payments were the same. So JobSeeker payments and the DSP rate they were the same. However, because of the differential way in which they're indexed, DSP payments are now more than what you can get on the JobSeeker, and that's because of this differing indexation rate. There's been a lot of it's a bit of a political football, right? The indexation of these benefits, and that's why I think that the JobSeeker payments are not indexed at the same rate as the DSP. I won't wade into that, but it's important that you do know that they're indexed differently, and the DSP is at a higher rate. Now, the other thing that I said that we would speak about in this presentation is carers payments and allowances. Really important to both people who are diagnosed with and affected by multiple sclerosis, but also those that care for them. So carers rates are basically the same as the DSP for the carers payment. Carers payment is basically a pension, and it has the same income and assets tests as those which apply to the DSP. Treated in a very similar way. And reasonably restricted if you think about it in terms of the DSP being a fairly a higher amount of payment than the carers allowance or the JobSeeker, and also one that is limited to people who are owning fewer assets and also earning less, whereas the carers allowance is paid at a much lower rate, so it's $150 a fortnight roughly in September 2024, but has a much higher income threshold. In other words, people can earn quite a bit more. So it's a benefit that's open to far more people than that applies to the carers payments. So in terms of the eligibility for JobSeeker, and we'll also speak about eligibility for the DSP in turn. However, what's important to note here, aside from the residency requirements, the mutual obligations are probably the main thing that people have difficulty with. There's a point system for mutual obligations in which you need to earn 100 points per month through activities such as applying for jobs, and doing other courses related to seeking employment. So it's designed, uh, as the name suggests, to help people seek employment. It's meant to be a temporary payment. However, we do often see people that are unwell and not otherwise eligible for the DSP using JobSeeker as a form of income, whilst their DSP entitlement is either uh, assessed, or whilst their DSP eligibility, well, whilst their condition stabilises or perhaps deteriorates to a point where they are entitled to the DSP. We see people getting the JobSeeker payments in those circumstances. And often in those circumstances, people can rely on a medical exemption, which means that they don't need to satisfy the mutual obligation requirements in order to be entitled to the payment. So for a medical exemption to apply, you need to not be or be unable to work 30 hours because of a medical condition, and you can get either a partial or a full exemption for a period of up to 2 years on each individual assessment. And we say that a lot, as I said, is relates to the DSP eligibility. And this is a much more complicated test or eligibility test that needs to be satisfied. And I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail about this because it is something that people with illness or injury, particularly people with MS, have some trouble understanding. However, once satisfied, it's a more stable and higher rate of payment that people can be entitled to. So I've put everything on this slide relating to age and residency requirements. But ultimately, when we get to the nuts and bolts of it, in order to be entitled to the DSP, you must have a permanent physical, intellectual, or psychiatric condition which has been diagnosed, reasonably treated, and stabilized. And that dot point is a change recently, whereas it used to need to be fully diagnosed, fully treated, and fully stabilized. There's been a recognition that that was causing a lot of problems, and really wasn't practical because of the changing nature of particularly degenerative or chronic illnesses. And so now we have a diagnosed, reasonably treated, and stabilized. The fully is no longer there. You need to also, these are all ends, as it says there, you also need to have 20 points under the impairment tables, which I'll discuss at length. And you need to have completed a program of support, a POS, or a program of support, which is normally provided by a disability employment service provider. And you need to be unable to work 15 hours or more per week for the next at least 2 years. And I alluded to that before, whereas you get kicked off the DSP if you're consistently working more than 30 hours. To get on, you need to not be able to work 15 or more because of illness, and that needs to be the case for 2 years. But once on, there is that leeway up to 30 for a period. So those are the DSP eligibility points, but there are some exceptions, which are if a person, I spoke about the need to have 20 points under the tables, and if you have 20 points under the tables plural, so more than one table, then you need to complete the program of support, which is an 18-month program provided by a disability employment service, which focuses on job seeking, very, very similar to the mutual obligations requirements. However, if you as an individual are assessed and have 20 points under one single table, in other words, you'll see later, you have a severe disability under the tables, then you can avoid the requirement to go through the program of support. And that's really important because the program of support, as I said, takes 18 months, and your DSP can't start if you've done until you've completed the 18 months. So during that period, you'd more than likely be on JobSeeker payments with a medical exemption. So there's a huge advantage, an 18-month advantage in most cases, to being able to satisfy the 20-point requirement under one table. And I'll probably reinforce that throughout this presentation as we go and work through some of the tables and how they would apply and how to get proven entitlement under the various tables. So the other exception to the satisfying the eligibility requirements, or some of them that I mentioned, particularly the table requirements, residency and age requirements can't be, the exceptions don't apply to, but the table requirements, the other exceptions is if you're permanently blind or you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness, which is certified as having less than 2 years to live. You have an intellectual disability with an IQ of less than 70. nursing home care. So really the ones that we see that often are relied on by people with MS are sometimes the blindness issue, although MS blindness is not always permanent. It usually isn't. But however, we do see sometimes people relying on that to get around some of the eligibility requirement, and sadly the nursing home care as well. So if these things apply, or if there's a cognitive incapacity which is brought on by the MS, then we can sometimes get around these eligibility requirements which would otherwise apply. So I've spoken a lot about the tables, the DSP impairment tables, and I haven't yet told you I don't think that there are 15. And we do sometimes see that a big part of an individual's problem with a claim is that it's quite difficult to disentangle the various symptoms of an individual's illness, particularly an MS diagnosis, and attribute those to single tables. And that is something that can plague DSP claimants irrespective of the condition, but I think particularly with chronic conditions which manifest in various ways. We've put an asterisk on this table against functions or tables that are commonly relied on by people with an MS diagnosis to make a claim. And you'll see there that with asterisks, functions requiring physical exertion and stamina. So that the big issue that people diagnosed with MS often are having trouble with is fatigue, so stamina. We there talk about lower limb function. We perhaps should put upper limb function in there as well, but lower limbs there also. Mental health function. A diagnosis of MS can also lead to the diagnosis of other psychiatric or psychological conditions, understandably, given the adjustment that's required and the uncertainty. We also have asterisk brain function there, which I think is straightforward, depending on where your lesions are. Visual functions, once again, depending on where the lesions are. So these are the tables that are frequently relied on by people with an MS diagnosis to claim. And as I was saying, sometimes with an MS diagnosis, whilst we want to get 20 points under one table, we do have to rely on various tables due to a combination of symptoms. But it is an idea to really rely on or focus on the impairment or the symptom which is most significant, and put that front and center and try and get our 20 points under that one table, and then fall back on using multiple tables to get to our 20 points. So we've created some proformas to help people prove an entitlement or eligibility to the DSP, and they can be used by people with any manner of disability, but frequently and particularly people with MS. And so the proformas have doctors' forms which address the requirements under each of the 15 tables for the severe, moderate, and mild. There are different requirements to each, which I'll speak to in a minute. There's also correspondence to you from us, to an individual from us, but also to doctors, explaining the requirements under the table and enclosing these proformas, which can be used by either yourself or your caseworker. So the most important part of a DSP application is the certification which is provided by the doctors, and making sure that they address the relevant criteria. And the materials we've put together speak to that in detail. So you can, in addition to filling in the forms which come from Centrelink for the DSP, you can also use the proformas alongside those to make the claim initially, or you can wait and provide them later if issues arise based on the materials which have been presented. The feedback we get about the proformas we put together is there's a simplicity within them that doesn't necessarily come through in the Centrelink based forms. Centrelink based forms can be a little difficult to understand, and so these forms can be used alongside them. The next slide will talk about some other aspects of them. So in making a claim for a DSP, the Centrelink will usually arrange for you to undergo a job capacity assessment and maybe a disability medical assessment. And there's no time limits necessarily for them to go through the process of assessing your claim. There's no time limits that they have to be bound by, whereas there are, in fact, time limits for you to appeal if the claim is rejected. But sometimes where there are long delays, we find that lodging additional material with the proformas that we've provided can help. But if you do make a claim and it's rejected, then you do have an entitlement to make an internal review to Centrelink directly. They call that an authorised review officer review, so an ARO review. And then you can do an external review to the administration, the AAT. At the time of this presentation, the AAT still exists. That is slated to change, but has not yet. Tier 1, and then there's a Tier 2 appeal as well. So if the claim's rejected, I think it's probably a good idea to get advice and get some further medical evidence that plugs the holes that Centrelink has identified. And I've given you some resources on the bottom of that slide. I'm sorry about the fact that that slide and the next few are a little bit text heavy. However, there's some resources on there that I think you'll find quite useful if these things do happen to you. So what are the templates that I'm rabbiting on about? I mentioned earlier that there's one that is a letter effectively to your doctor enclosing the medical report or medical pro forma that they need to complete to support the claim. And I've got it on the screen now. I won't read from it. I'll let you do that in your time. But basically, we've found, and the feedback that we've gotten or obtained from our clients over years, is that doctors simply don't understand the test. And I will say that firsthand, I've seen frequently doctors providing reports in support of a DSP application, which say, I support Jimmy's application for a DSP, disability support pension. Now, that's useless. Sadly, it's well intended, but it's useless. That report, it matters little that the doctor supports the application. The doctor's support for the application needs to be funneled in accordance with the requirements under the tables. In other words, it needs to specifically address the functional impairment that the individual suffers as a result of their condition, their permanent impairment, permanent medical condition. And it needs to say in detail how it is that those different symptoms that they suffer, the illness that they have, impacts various aspects of their life. And without having that, the support is not useful. So that's why I say it's useless. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it is. The next table, I mean, that text, it will be hard for people to read, but what this is it is the DSP report or the pro forma that's to be used for people and provided in support of an application where you're going for a mild impairment. So I've focused on here functions relating to physical exertion and stamina, because as I say, fatigue is probably the most commonly reported MS symptom that I experience. I stand to be corrected by experts, but fatigue's one that we often hear about. So even if it's not the sole or predominant symptom, it's one that almost always exists. So, and you will see there that this form asks doctors questions which are aimed at the table. So if you were to go to the tables and look at the tables, it speaks to what functional impairments must be present for a person to have a 5-point impairment, a 10-point impairment, a 20-point impairment, working backwards, a mild, moderate, and severe disability under the tables. So to get 5 points, you'll see there under question 7 that a person needs to experience occasional symptoms, and then occasional being the key word. It needs to be a mild shortness of breath, fatigue, cardiac pain, all mild. So occasional mild symptoms when performing physically demanding activities, and has occasional difficulties with day-to-day activities. So what that effectively means is that an individual can have occasional, so infrequent symptoms. They don't have to be present all the time. They can be present only when doing physically demanding activities, and they can be mild, and that will get you 5 points. So in the scheme of things, not that I would wish those symptoms upon anybody, but in the scheme of things, a relatively mild level of impairment is required to get, surprisingly, a mild impairment approved. However, if you would go to the 10-point for fatigue, which is on the screen now, then what we see is a different test, which is spoken about there. And specifically, you need to experience frequent symptoms. So occasional is replaced with frequent. So it's a more serious level of ongoing impairment in terms of frequency, in terms of when it happens. And then if we look to the EG, it's a shortness of breath, fatigue, and cardiac pain. So we're not talking now about mild. The word mild's been removed, and we're just talking about a frequent shortness of breath when performing day-to-day activities, as opposed to physically demanding activities around the home and in the community. So with these tables, we often see a focus on your ability to do things around the home and to participate in the community. And so that the focus here is squarely on that with 10. So that is, I would think, a much more difficult definition to satisfy. And we've tailored the pro forma around that to try and draw that nuance from the tables out to support an individual's claim. We go to the next slide for the more serious or the 20-point severe fatigue test. So this is, again, the pro forma that is used for that. And here we're talking about a usual experience. So again, the frequencies, and I'm sorry to labor these points, but the frequency has increased. A usual experience of symptoms, e.g. shortness of breath. So it's not, but the severity of the symptom hasn't necessarily increased, but the frequency has. When performing light physical activities due to the symptoms, and we're talking about an inability to walk around a shopping centre. So we're quite prescriptive to walk from the car park, to use public transport without assistance, or to perform light day-to-day activities. So hopefully that those proformas, well, first of all, hopefully you now know they exist and they can be very useful for people claiming the DSP, but also hopefully that example draws out some of the differences between a mild, moderate, and a severe certification. And so you can see the level of specificity which is required in order to be successful with the claim, which hopefully proves the point I was making earlier for you about how it's not helpful if a doctor says, I support Jimmy's application for a disability support pension. In that scenario, that certification doesn't help. We need to be quite prescriptive. And this is given you an example of how this works using these pro formas. But to give a real world example, I helped a lady who suffered from MS previously with a DSP application, and she suffered from fatigue and also from cognitive impairment as a result of lesions that were on her brain. And she, in applying for the DSP, had not been entirely forthcoming with her doctors and her support workers with respect to the level of her impairment. And so her application for the DSP was rejected. However, once she was, and that's because really no one had drilled down into, all right, how does your household run? Who and when someone did drill down to how the household run, it became clear that she would frequently forget that stoves were on, the stove was on, or the pots were on the stove. As a result, didn't often cook a meal, but would eat salads and cold cuts and things like that as a result of her difficulties recalling or remembering that things were cooking. She relied on neighbours to put bins out because she would forget bin night. She had quite a good support network around her that she was able to rely on. Some meals were provided by friends and neighbours and family also. There was some shame for her and some stigma in this, and it wasn't something that she liked to speak to people about. So when doctors were asked, does she have difficulty doing certain tasks or remembering certain things as is required under the cognitive test, which is very similar to this fatigue one that I'm speaking about, she was not necessarily being giving a fulsome account of what goes on day to day in her life. And so then when the support that the doctors were giving for a claim wasn't useful. So it's really important, I think, when helping someone with a DSP claim or when making one yourself, that you do be really honest about the physical and other cognitive or whatever the limitations are that apply, and be really provide really robust answers which account for, in some cases, perhaps your worst days, not necessarily your best days. I think as individuals we have a tendency to focus on the good, the positive, rather than negative. That doesn't necessarily help with the DSP application. So that's how the DSP applications work. That's how the eligibility requirements work, and that's how the proformas that we've put together can be used. The proformas are something that we're happy to provide to people without charge, and you need only contact us or MS Plus to get copies of the proformas and that toolkit that we can distribute to you to help you with the application. You really just need to identify which tables apply to you, and then you can request the relevant proformas from us. Now, the second part, or the last part of this presentation, having discussed in depth how the different eligibility requirements for the JobSeeker and the DSP work, and similarly the income thresholds and whatnot, and the rates. We're going to speak a little bit now about how disability insurance entitlements, whether in super or insurance, how they can impact on the ways that you are paid your Centrelink entitlements. So if you are getting Centrelink entitlements, then it's important to understand that if you haven't already made a claim for a super-based or insurance-based uh, disability benefits, that you may also be entitled to these, which can supplement the income that you receive on a monthly basis from Centrelink with these insurance entitlements, or can give you lump sum entitlements that you can be entitled to. So I'm talking specifically here about income protection, TPD, trauma, and in some cases terminal illness benefits. These all are entitlements that you can claim, and colleagues of mine have spoken about these in other presentations. So I'm not going to go into detail about exactly what they are, but I am going to focus on how very briefly give you a description of what they are and where you might have them, and also how they impact on the entitlements that you can be getting from Centrelink. If you have ever worked since 1992, you almost certainly will have a super employment super that's been paid for you, and you may have more than one account. And so if you do suffer from a disability which impacts on your work capacity, you more than likely will have an entitlement to claim some or all of the superannuation account balance early, if that's what you decide to do, subject to tax and financial advice. You may also have an entitlement to a total and permanent, or a TPD, insurance lump sum benefit. You may have an income protection or a salary continuance payment that can be paid to each month, and you probably have insurance cover that covers you and pays out a benefit to your loved ones if you die, or if you suffer from a terminal illness, you can get early access to that death benefit lump sum payment. And that's really around insurance and super. But outside of super, you may also have some entitlements. So we'll talk briefly about outside of super, some of the same benefits may also be there. So if you've made arrangements directly with an insurance company, or you've spoken to a financial advice company and you've gone and got advice from that person and they've helped you claim insurance benefits, then you may have income protection, TPD, and trauma benefits that can pay out, or a life or death policy that can pay out there as well. And so trauma is one that does almost always apply to MS if you've got it. If you've got a policy of trauma or some trauma insurance, or what's called a living benefit, then you may be able to claim a lump sum benefit from that insurance company, simply just because of the diagnosis of the MS, without any consideration around whether or not you've got a work capacity or a working capacity, which can be really quite useful to get you over that initial shock, and perhaps the drop in your income that may come at the first attack, or the first diagnosis, even if you're otherwise able to continue working without restriction for the rest of your working life, as can often be the case. And aside from having gone to the person down the street and making arrangements to get insurance cover through a financial planner or advisor, you may also have it through, you may also have insurance cover through your employer. So your employer may make arrangements for all of its staff to have income protection, trauma, TPD cover, and that may be something that you can apply on in the event that you suffer from a illness which impacts on your work capacity, or just simply at the time of diagnosis with a condition like MS. So it's worth making these inquiries with your HR team and whatnot. So then the question becomes, how does claiming these benefits impact on your Centrelink entitlements? And it's really different depending on how the benefit is held. So as I said, you could have it through super, you could have it individually, or you could have it through your employer. Now, having it individually, so going down the street and getting it, and having it through your employer are very similar in the way they're treated, but super is treated very differently. So if you have a lump sum insurance entitlement held in your superannuation account, it pays out if you become totally and permanently unable to work again in any occupation that you're suited to by education, training, or experience. It's a garden variety definition. They vary, but that's what the definition means, and that's when you'll be paid out. Now, if that happens, initially the money will be paid into your super account. It will become part of your super account balance. And you may recall earlier I mentioned that superannuation is an exempt asset when we're talking about asset tests, and it's also exempt from the income test. Income that's earned on the super stays in the super account, and provided the money stays in the account, it won't have any impact on your day-to-day Centrelink entitlements. So the TPD benefit, sorry, I realize I'm speaking to the next slide. Can you skip forward and then we'll skip back? So these lump sum TPD benefits which are paid into your super can be left there and they remain exempt. If they are withdrawn, if you withdraw money from your super early, whether it's TPD or any other money that you may hold in your super, then that lump sum entitlement will form part of your assets test for the purposes of determining whether you have too many assets. So if you, for example, are single and you live in your home, um, then you can have assets of up to $314,000 before there's any impact on your Centrelink entitlements. So if the TPD benefit that you receive as a single person living in a home that you own is less than 314, or the super account balance is, then you can withdraw all of your TPD benefit and all of your income protection entitlements, and there shouldn't be any impact from an assets test perspective on your Centrelink entitlements. But you'll remember though, I've spoken a little bit about deeming income. So depending on what you do with that money that you withdraw, there may be an impact on your income test if there's a deemed income on the money once it comes out. So there will be tax on the withdrawal also. So you should always get financial advice about these matters from a tax perspective and also from a Centrelink assets and income test perspective. But very loosely speaking, claiming a TPD benefit that's in super, if kept in super, is going to have no impact on Centrelink. And then once there, then you can get some advice and make some informed decisions about withdrawing the benefit. If you lump sum in withdrawals from super, I've mentioned, are assets, as I've just described in the example. If you instead elect to take out a disability income stream, so rather than take out the lump sum asset from super, whether it be TPD or account balance, you take out an income stream. So you say, oh, I'm electing to have a monthly pension paid to me from my super early on the grounds of disability, something that can be done for people if they have a permanent working capacity, the same test that allows them to withdraw money from super. If that applies, then that will offset, even though it's super that's being withdrawn, which would be an asset if it was a lump sum withdrawal. If it's withdrawn as a super pension, then it's going to be income from an income perspective and be affected by the income test. The income test for the DSP, I think I said, was $212 per fortnight. So if your super pension exceeds that amount, it's going to start to offset your DSP 50 cents on the dollar up until the relevant threshold. Now they're talking about super. As I mentioned, TPD can also be provided individually. So it can be provided as a product that you purchased via a financial planner, or it can be provided as an offshoot of your employment, as an employment entitlement. And if that is the case, then there's no option to preserve the money in super and keep it exempt. The money will be paid directly to you, and once it's paid to you, it will automatically trigger an asset test issue if you're above that 314 threshold that I mentioned for single people in the DSP. The thresholds are earlier in the presentation. So depending on the amount of the TPD benefit that's paid to you outside of super, then that's going to cause issues from an assets test perspective and also from an income deeming perspective. But importantly, those lump sum TPD benefits paid to you as a lump sum will not impact on your Centrelink entitlements as income. However, if we were to skip back to the previous slide, income protection entitlements can be held in super or they can be held outside of super. Super funds like Australian Super, Rest, Hester frequently provide default income protection insurance cover to their members. Some of them also provide a TPD benefit, which I've just been speaking about. Irrespective of whether that income protection benefit is held in super or held externally, so uh, like with TPD, the other alternative to have income protection is to go and buy it through a financial planner and structure it directly so you own it personally, or structure it through super. No matter which one you do, those income protection benefits will be paid to you. There's no option to preserve them in super. In most cases, that can't be done. So that money can't be preserved or in an exempt structure through super. It'll be paid directly to you and automatically trigger an income test issue for you. If, again, the thresholds were earlier in the presentation, but for a single person on the DSP, 212 is the fortnightly figure you can earn at the present time without it impacting your DSP entitlement. Beyond that, 50 cents on the dollar is offset. And almost all of those products that I'm speaking about as default products are going to trigger they're going to be above the income test threshold. Even Hester, which has the lower of those benefits presently, will be more than you are entitled to earn without it impacting your Centrelink, and then the 50 cents in the dollar offset will apply up until a certain point. Importantly, most income protection benefits are going to exceed your DSP entitlement and therefore going to be worthwhile claiming financially. However, the issue may be that having been paid the income protection benefit for a period, they're often up to 2 years of payments. They can be longer, but they're often up to 2 years. At the end of that 2-year payment period, you may have to reapply for your DSP. It may not just remain inactive or inert in the background with an entitlement sitting there. They may say, all right, well, you've received this income, so now you're off the DSP. You may have to reapply, and if your condition has improved in the period since you previously became eligible, then that can cause issues for you outside of these immediate financial concerns. In other words, IP income protection better financially in the short term, but may interfere with your entitlement to the DSP in the long term. So something to take into account when considering that. And the last dot point there says get advice, which is always a good idea. So that's how these insurance benefits can impact on Centrelink entitlements. People often have questions about how these benefits work, how the offsets work, and I've taken every precaution I can to cover everything that is relevant, but there are increasingly questions that aren't necessarily fitting within the mold and may require answering that in a more complicated way. So if that applies to you, it's a long-winded way of saying if your circumstances haven't been covered by this presentation, you may call us. That is our general reception number there, 9448 804803. My direct line is 03 9448 8046, 8046 at the end. You may call our firm or me directly at any time if you have questions about Centrelink entitlement, Centrelink eligibility, DSP issues, interaction of Centrelink and superannuation and other disability entitlements. More than happy to speak to you on the phone, or if email is your jam, you can give us an email. And lastly, I have banged on a little bit about the DSP toolkit in this presentation. That link there is to the Social Security Rights Victoria's website where you can find a copy of the toolkit. If you have issues with that, you can also contact us on the email and we can give you a copy or direct you to where it may be housed in the future. So that is all from me for this presentation. As I said, I'm more than happy to take your calls or emails with questions if I haven't covered what you needed to know. But for now, I'll say goodbye and thanks for listening.